Make sure I'm not muted. So good evening, everyone. I'm Suzanne Gaulocher. I am a professor of public health at Plymouth State University here in New Hampshire. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Caleb Dresser tonight for our New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. My dog is behind me playing with a can. So Dr. Caleb Dresser is an emergency physician at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston and an instructor at Harvard Medical School. He is an assistant director of the Fellowship in Climate and Human Health and is affiliated with the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights and the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. His research focuses on understanding the health implications of climate-related disasters and human mobility, and he is actively involved in the efforts to educate healthcare workers, policymakers, and the general public about the values of action to protect human health in the context of ongoing climate crisis. And so with that, Dr. Dresser, look forward to hearing your presentation. Before he launches into his presentation, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we can get to those when we move to the dialogue portion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on a great turnout. Thank you all for making time in your day to talk about this. My goal is to spend about 35 or 40 minutes going through some content that I think is important to understand about climate change, what it means for human migration, how we talk about the people who are on the move, and what it means for our practice as clinicians or as members of a community, that this is happening and will continue to happen at probably increasing scale in coming decades. I encourage all of you to share your perspectives and experiences either during the time that I'm speaking or in the Q&A afterwards, because I have my perspective as an emergency physician and an academic, but this is a fundamentally community-based issue, and this is a fundamentally diverse issue. And so if you have a perspective or an experience you want to share, I encourage you to do that, because I think we all have quite a bit to learn from one another on how to deal with these issues and how to think about them. So I want to start with a case. This is a case I actually saw in residency. It was a gentleman in his 70s. He was Spanish speaking, and he had been brought to our emergency department directly from Logan Airport. His chief complaint was generalized weakness, which is a fairly common chief complaint in the emergency department. And when we started speaking with him through an interpreter, it turned out that the real issue was that he had run out of medicines a couple of weeks earlier and had not been taking his insulin. He was an insulin-dependent type 2 diabetic, had not been taking his blood pressure medicine, and generally felt his health had been deteriorating. And he had a fair number of chronic medical issues, was not acutely distressed, but looked dehydrated and a bit unwell, and wound up having quite a few lab abnormalities. And when we got to talking through the sort of social history portion of his H&P, it turned out that he was coming from an environment that looked a lot like this. And this is what Puerto Rico looked like in the late fall of 2017 after Hurricane Maria. And this gentleman had navigated several weeks of life in this environment with deteriorating access to healthcare until eventually he was flown out by his daughter, along with many, many, many other people in the aftermath of that storm. And this for me was sort of a sentinel moment in my awareness of what climate change was going to mean for my career. That even in Boston, thousands of miles away from this storm, this was directly impacting patients under my care. And I needed to know what to do for this gentleman and for a number of other people in similar circumstances, which in some cases really boiled down to reestablishing connectivity with the health system in a way that worked for them, often finding places that had Spanish-speaking primary care providers, providing bridge prescriptions until people could get in to see those new providers. And this has stuck with me as a powerful moment, meeting a fellow American who was essentially fleeing a climate-related disaster. And as we have seen in the news over the last couple of years, this is a recurrent issue and is one that we need to, at this point, face head on and deal with. What we're going to talk about today is a series of different topics. We're going to talk a little bit about climate change in general, although I'm going to move through that very quickly, since if you're a member of this group, I imagine you're pretty aware of this issue. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the forces that underpin the movement of people in response to climate change, things that push people to move, things that keep them in place. We're also going to talk a little bit about language and terminology, because this matters a lot when we talk about or write about or advocate about this issue. We need to be precise in who we're talking about and for what audiences. We're going to look at a couple of case studies which we can debate, because this is an active area of discussion and research. And then we're going to talk about some of the ways this connects up to general clinical practice. So, as far as background, I think we're probably all familiar with the whole fossil fuel emissions issue. We are still burning a very large amount of fossil fuel to generate energy globally. And CO2 levels continue to build up in the atmosphere along with other greenhouse gases, which act as an insulating blanket around the Earth and have resulted in rising temperatures, which are projected to continue to rise into the future. It is worth pointing out here that we have a great deal of agency as a globe over how aggressively that trajectory goes, and that there's a whole lot we can do to avoid bad outcomes and protect human health by minimizing future greenhouse gas emissions. But at this point, we are going to see at least some degree of ongoing climate change, and it is having a plethora of effects on ecosystems, on natural disaster risk, perhaps not so natural in this context, on sea level rise, and a variety of other factors that affect human health. When we look at the United States in particular, purely looking at historical data, there are no computer models in this slide. We see increasing numbers of heat waves per year. We see increasing heat wave intensity and the duration of the season in which we experience heat waves. So this is already happening. Wildfires are on the rise. Some of that is related to development patterns and human-related ignition sources and forest management decisions. And some of that is related to climate change. And if you're in a part of the United States, I saw we had a couple of people here from California, this is a very significant ecosystem disruptor and human disruptor that is leading to quite a lot of human mobility, both in the short and the long term. Rainfall is going to be a particular issue here in the US Northeast. I practice at a hospital in downtown Boston, but also at a community site west of Boston. And the next hospital down the road flooded in an unseasonable extreme rainstorm a couple of years ago, still has not been rebuilt. And my little community hospital saw about 30% increase in volume in the middle of the pandemic. And so I would not underestimate how much climate change may be impacting healthcare institutions where we are. In some case, meaning that patients are now crossing into new locations and new healthcare systems to get care, mobility at a local level. Finally, sea level rise is happening, is accelerating, and is headed, we don't quite know where, but it is concerning. And I think there's a couple of recent studies that have come out suggesting it may be a little bit more concerning than we had thought even a couple of years ago. Stay tuned on the science for that. But for a state like New Hampshire that has some coastline and some estuaries, this is a non-trivial issue. All of those forces are big picture. They act on a scale of decades, but with acute exacerbations, much as COPD is a gradual disease that has acute exacerbations. And those exacerbations are where we see a lot of the morbidity from that disease. When we think about what climate change's gradual change, which is accelerating, means for people who may be on the move, I think it's helpful to break down how it is affecting people in terms of their physical safety, the economic environment they're in, and to some extent the political environment that they're in, and what this means in terms of motivation to stay where you are or to move to a new place, and some of the factors that can affect that. The first big thing I want to talk about is heat. This has a very clear relationship with greenhouse gas emissions and climate forcing. And I think anyone who has worked in the summertime in New England is aware that this can have pretty significant effects on patients, particularly the elderly, people with various chronic medical conditions. And if you look at this at a global level, this may get to a point where there are areas that are not long-term habitable due to extended periods of very high wet bulb temperatures in the summertime, extending for weeks or months. The science is still evolving on this. This is all modeling based at this point, but there's pretty substantial reason for concern about parts of the American Southwest, parts of South Asia, and some other locations that may make it long-term difficult to live in those places and may be a push for people to move into other locations. Sea level rise is another gradual but very powerful force. These are images of Bangladesh illustrating the scale of loss of surface area of that country in various sea level rise scenarios, which are plausible within the next several decades. This obviously has a huge impact on the livelihoods of the people in the places that are slowly being inundated, and has the potential to create very large streams of people moving in search of safety and livelihood elsewhere. And this is not an issue that is entirely limited to low-lying river deltas. This is a photograph taken in Miami a couple of years ago. And I think we in the United States need to be aware that a lot of our developed areas are coastal. And so while you may have stepped into this talk thinking I'm only going to talk about international migration, I am very much focused as well on domestic migration within the United States, because there's quite a lot that will be happening within our borders that will be affecting people's ability to continue to live where they currently do. Drought is the other big force at play at a global level that we need to really pay attention to, because this has a direct relationship with food insecurity, which long-term is one of the big, powerful factors throughout human history that has pushed people to move to new places and seek out new livelihoods. And while we tend to think of this largely from a rural agrarian standpoint, I think it's important to point out that many of the largest cities in subtropical regions right now are getting to the point with population and access to water where large numbers of people are dependent on tanker trucks or imported water to sustain themselves in those cities, which puts them in a very precarious position in hot weather and puts those cities as a whole in a fairly precarious position when a large fraction of the population is dependent on a fundamentally insecure way of getting fresh water. All of these can push people to move. This is an image from writers from a few years ago taken within the United States, illustrating what flooding can look like. And it doesn't take a lot of flooding to cause big problems. I think there can be a reaction to projections of sea level rise or to rainfall totals of what's a few inches. And the answer is a few inches can be a really big deal. It can be the difference between people showing up at your shop and no one showing up at your shop. It can be the difference between a viable economy and no economy. And so this is another thing that particularly within the United States, we're going to see more of. There's pretty good mapping showing where that will occur. And it is likely going to push people to begin moving to new places. It also has implications for food security. I think many of us can remember floods in the Midwest a couple of years ago and the impact those had on farmers. And farming is really, really important. We cannot forget that this is how we are feeding our population and that the stressors on the people who feed all of us are going up. And that as that happens, people may move off the land in search of other ways to feed their family, and we may have impacts on total food supply. All of that adds up to a situation that has a lot of people very nervous about political and potentially military implications. This has created a fairly extensive literature. This is just what you get if you start searching for books on that topic. I think at this point, the science on this is still quite mixed. I'm going to show you two graphs, one from a paper in Science that a group published a few years ago, and another from the rebuttal to that paper, reaching fundamentally different conclusions. The executive summary for all of us who are not specialists in the analysis of conflict from an academic standpoint is that climate change is a stressor and probably can contribute to civil strife, economic stress, and potentially political instability in some situations. But it is not a sufficient cause on its own. And we have to be respectful of how complicated every society where conflicts are occurring is, and how much those are linked to the political economy and the culture and the history of those places. This first graph is from a paper showing a statistically significant, very robust relationship between climate stressors and the outbreak of armed conflict. This graph is from the rebuttal to that paper by a different group of authors looking at the same data, finding no effect. I don't know what to do with this data other than to be aware that climate change is a stressor and in some cases probably can cause problems that may exacerbate existing political or military stressors. It is a little bit more clear that militarization is happening in response to either the movement of people or perceptions that there may be a movement of people. The India-Bangladesh border here on the left is something that has been happening for a long time, the increased fortification of this border. And there has been renewed attention to this in recent years, I think in part in the context of, hey, sea level rise is happening in Bangladesh a couple of hundred miles to the south, and there's the potential for a lot of people on the move. Similar things are happening in Central America. I think we're all familiar with the United States border, but it is worth pointing out that that is not the only Central American border where we have seen increased use of force to keep people from moving. And so that can act pretty powerfully to prevent people from moving out of places that are stressed from a climate position or into places that may be more desirable to live. Another big factor that can hold people in place is money. And if we look at movement, whether domestically within the United States or at a global level, it's expensive to move. Even if you are doing so outside the formal system, trying to illegally immigrate would be one phrase, seek a better life elsewhere would be another. However you want to phrase that, if you are trying to move even outside the standard pathways, this is expensive and it's often not successful. A large fraction of the people who undertake these journeys do not get where they're going. And so a lot of people may find themselves in what some people in the literature are referring to as climate traps, where you may have desertification happening and livelihoods that are failing, but you may not have enough money or capital in that setting to make the move away from that location in a substantive direction. What this means is that a lot of migration may be quite local because it's less expensive. If you look even at the US level, it costs a lot of money to relocate across the country, and that's not something that is feasible for everybody. It's infeasible for a lot of people. And it may be that smaller moves in response to gradually increasing rates of flooding or really high temperatures in urban areas, smaller moves may be more achievable and maybe something that we see more frequently, although it will probably get less press. Another factor, and I don't really like to use the word trap here, although that's how I had categorized these things for these talk. This might really be a pull to stay where you are, which is community. And I think we need to really think about what is being said by some of the quotes I've put on the right side of this slide. These are pulled from a New York Times article that came out in September of last year. And they're very powerful. I would encourage you to look up that article to get a perspective on what a climate-related disaster might mean to people who have grown up in a community and don't want to leave. And so while we can look from a distance and say, why would you rebuild right where your house burned down? Why would you do that? There are actually a lot of pretty good reasons to do that. And so as we think about policies to deal with climate change and policies related to the movement of people in adaptation to climate change, I think we need to remember there is a separate narrative about staying in place and all of the value that can have from a psychosocial standpoint and in terms of the economics of still being connected to your job. So we need to keep in mind that when we're talking about climate-related migration or distress migration, we probably should also be talking about what it means to help people stay where they are, because that's what a lot of people would prefer to do. As we look at this big picture, however, it is pretty clear that things will change in a way that is increasingly seeming to be predictable. If you look back at what people were modeling 30 years ago, reasonably accurate for what we're looking at now. There will be warming globally. There will be warming across the US. And if you look at something as simple as those maps on the back of a packet of tomato seeds when you go to plant your garden, the recommended planting dates and the zones of the country for which those apply have changed. These are the USDA zones as they've changed over the past 25, 30 years. And biomes and ecosystems are moving north, and that has implications for agriculture and all of the economies that go with that. Looked at even bigger picture, what this means is that there is an economic pull toward the poles. And conversely, there's an economic push away from some equatorial regions that are experiencing increasing climate-related stressors. This is not to say we should disinvest in those locations, but it is to say that if you think about how any other species moves in relation to a changing biome or a changing habitat, it would seem from this type of map that perhaps we should be moving toward the greener areas. The issue being, there are a whole lot of little black lines on this map that are borders that affect where people can or cannot move. And so a lot of the stress we see around this politically is related to flows of people that might make sense economically or ecologically, but don't necessarily line up with the politics of those locations. And the politics of this is complicated. I think it's important for us to spend a few minutes on vocabulary. And the vocabulary of this matters a lot, both legally in terms of the status of the people involved, and that has real repercussions for patients under our care and who we can refer them to and what kind of services we can connect them up with. It also has a lot of implications for how people think about themselves. And there are a lot of emotions and connotations attached to these words. Do you want to be called a refugee? What does it mean to be a migrant? Does that make you think of people picking vegetables in California? Does it make you think of people moving to the United States to do IT work? What is asylum? Can you seek asylum if you're not seeking it from a person or political entity? These are important questions. I want to start with the term refugee. This is thrown around a lot. It makes for a splashy headline if you talk about climate refugees. It is also a very specific, legally significant term to the United States government and to the United Nations and to other signatories to the Convention on the Status of Refugees. And refugees, from a legal standpoint, are people who are moving for fear of political persecution. They are in a place where an organized group of people, in most cases a government, is seeking them out because of race, religion, sexual orientation, or some other personal factor. And if you are a refugee under this convention, that comes with quite a lot of political assets. It comes with the ability to seek asylum in other countries. It comes with a pretty integrated refugee resettlement program in the United States and quite a lot of resources that we can refer people to as clinicians. The issue is that this does not describe most of the people who are on the move because of climate change. So are they migrants? This is how the UN talks about migrants. And this does not seem like a particularly good description of someone who has had to move because of climate change either. Because this calls up images of people moving around to do some work, make some money, return home at a later date. and does not necessarily communicate the severity of the situation they may be trying to get out of, and does not necessarily communicate that they may not have another choice other than to move. And so calling someone a migrant does not really capture this either. My opinion is that the best term for this group of people is probably distress migrants, or people engaged in distress migration, although there continues to be debate on exactly how to talk about it. The UN FAO was the originating body for this term, and they used it to capture people that are not fleeing political persecution. No one is coming to arrest them, but they cannot stay where they are because they will die. And this captures people who may be fleeing famine or other situations where life has become untenable in their current situation. So, as we think about these three terms, I think it is also worth pointing out that while we probably are picturing all of these as international issues, a lot of the people that fall into the category of distress migrants fall into that category without crossing international borders. If you look at the number of people on the move because of expanding deserts, rising sea levels, untenable agricultural situations, a very large proportion of those, as much as 95% in some of the countries that have been looked at, do not leave that country. They move from a rural agrarian setting to an urban environment. They move from a fishing village to a capital city. And what this means is that we are seeing large numbers of people moving into dense urban areas that are intrinsically a little more difficult to keep track of in terms of what's going on. The utility of things like satellite imagery to monitor crop failures and presumed food distress is not as good if you're just looking down at a city. The roofs look the same. And so increasingly, this mobility issue in relation to climate change is also intimately tied up with patterns of urbanization and development, particularly in some of the rapidly expanding cities, both in the US and abroad. So just checking on time, I saw a very good question about the ethics of movement. We will get into that in a few minutes, and I'm interested in everyone's perspective. I do want to talk about a couple of case studies, and I will preface this by saying that all of this is an area of sort of active debate and research, because attributing any specific event to climate change is hard, and attributing a complex socio-political event to an event that is attributed to climate change is extra hard. And so I would think of these as more of stories or parables that show some plausible connections rather than definitive scientific analysis, because there's still active academic debate. The first topic to go into is Syria. There's a narrative related to the Syrian civil war that looks at climate stress in the Fertile Crescent, and specifically temperature and rainfall in Syria, particularly in the north, in the years leading up to the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. And they had a extremely bad drought. Satellite imagery, if you look back historically, does show a significant decrease in green foliage in a lot of areas that are agrarian or herding-based economies. And it's believed that there was a fairly significant movement of people into urban areas in Syria shortly before the outbreak of hostilities. I am not an expert on Syria, and I can't tell you exactly what happened next. There is some thought that that influx of people destitute coming out of stressed areas may have contributed to the volatility of the situation. But in any event, we saw a very large movement of people out of Syria as a result of that civil war. And there's another question, a very good question, and we will talk about that in a few minutes. In Latin America, we've seen a similar set of dynamics, not the armed conflict per se, but the drought and the movement of people. If you look at temperature changes in Central America and changes in rainfall, there is an area in rain shadow downwind of mountains that is referred to as the dry corridor, which has seen pretty significant drought, multiple years of crop failures, and eventually people saying, enough is enough. I have sold off my equipment and I am no longer farming and I'm leaving the land and moving to the capital city or potentially further north. This is an image from a New York Times project that modeled movement of people in coming decades under various border control and climate change scenarios that found a lot of movement into urban areas and potentially north toward the United States as well, depending on the degree of climate stress in the region. And I think it's important, somebody was mentioning water out west just now in the comments. This is going to be a big issue. And, if a publication like Rolling Stone is talking about this, I think this is now a mainstream issue that all of us should be aware of. Because if you look, again, similar to that red and green map of the world with some ethical questions we will get into, this is a orange and blue map of the United States showing where you're going to see shorter winters, longer grower seasons, a little bit more rainfall. And notably, I would point out that New Hampshire is looking pretty good on this map. And where you're going to see heat and drought and other issues like that, or significant sea level rise in low-lying areas. The reason I include this map is that I think it's important for us to note that what climate change means for us here in New England is partly heat waves and sea level rise and other stressors directly from climate change here, but it probably also means people in search of a better life will be coming here. And many of these people may be Americans moving from 3 or 4 states to the south in search of a place where they don't have to run their AC for as many months per year. And so we need to think about that as another dimension of this human mobility that will be a very different thing to deal with from some of the traditional sort of approaches to international refugees that we may have been trained on previously. It's also worth pointing out this is happening at a local level. And if you look at the physical locations within cities where we have different types of medical, healthcare, or social infrastructure, these are not necessarily going to line up with where human need is long term. There has been some interesting data coming out of Miami showing that in some of the poorer, more ethnically diverse parts of the city, which happen to be on higher level ground than places like Miami Beach, property values have rapidly escalated as people from outside those neighborhoods start buying up land or putting up developments in places that don't flood and are unlikely to flood in the next few decades. And when you look at property values as a whole, this is from Dr. Keenan's group at Harvard, you can see that the red line, that's the parts of Miami-Dade County that are below 1 meter above sea level, have had property appreciation values that don't keep up with the rest of the county. And so the economy, the real estate market, is starting to price in climate change. And if you think about that long term, what will always happen is that the undesirable places will become cheaper. And then when it's cheaper to live there, the people that I think all of us are trying to serve who are highly impacted, highly at risk, are more likely to live in those at-risk locations where it's less expensive to live. And so if we look at something as simple as storm surge risk in Boston, we need to be paying attention to which populations are living where, and does the location of that community health center that was built 50 years ago correspond to where the at-risk, high-need population lives today? Because we may well be seeing movements of population at the level of neighborhoods or municipalities in relation to localized climate threats. And we need to think about how we provide care for those populations as well. So on to a couple of connections to our clinical work. I do want to mention this because I think we have a lot of medical professionals on this. And just provide some of this as hopefully reminders, some thoughts on how we care for this population. So if we are caring for distressed migrants, whether domestic or international, I think it's important for us to not label them as refugees, both because of the social connotations that comes with. A lot of people are really opposed to be labeled as refugees. They're like, no, I chose to move here. This is my own decision. I'm not seeking asylum. And we also need to be careful about just assuming that people migrated to make more money, because that may mean that we miss some of the cues related to post-disaster trauma or other social or community losses that those patients may be trying to navigate. I think it's also worth pointing out that the refugee resettlement programs through the US government work pretty well if you're a refugee and are not available if you are not a refugee. And so the assumptions we make about people who may be on the move because of climate need to recognize that these people will probably not have access to this refugee resettlement process. It is worth emphasizing that we have a lot of resources related to refugee health. This is a screenshot of a Massachusetts state website. I imagine New Hampshire has something similar. There are a lot of guidelines and screening guidelines and immunization guidelines, et cetera. And I think we need to remember that for distressed migrants from climate change, some of this may be very relevant, and we need to be thoughtful about what we include and what we do not, but that we don't necessarily have a similar nice checklist for this population. That said, it's important that we provide access to care for everyone. I think we have a responsibility to do this from an ethical standpoint. I think it's also good medicine, and for a lot of these patients means that they will have better long-term health and better contribute to the society they are now living in if we maintain good health for everybody. One of the big pieces from a very nitty-gritty standpoint is providing good language interpreting services. For those of you who work in big medical centers that serve a diverse patient population or live in a community that has a substantial foreign language population, this is probably very familiar. But I think it's worth mentioning for everyone as a reminder that we are legally required to offer language services for all of our patients. I'm in an emergency department, so under EMTALA, I can't say no to anybody. They're there and we have to figure out a way to talk to them. And if your institution is not able to provide this, it's something you should probably look into as soon as you can. There are a lot of ways to do this in person, by phone, by video. And I think because we are all very busy people who try to move efficiently, it is worth just pausing to remember we cannot assume that just because someone is nodding that they understand what we are saying. We cannot rely on family members for this by default. And we should not be pretending that we understand a language we only partially speak, particularly because we don't necessarily know the medical terminology. So important to engage good interpreter services. One of the reasons for this is that conversations beyond where is your abdominal pain might get into more nuanced topics like what did happen to you in that hurricane that really may be difficult to explore if you are relying on a family member to translate who may have their own agenda or perspective on it, or if you're relying on incomplete language skills. So very important to have that. The other piece to talk about is trauma-informed care. This is something that I think should be high on the list if you're taking care of refugees in most situations. I mention this here because it is very important from the standpoint of distressed migrants. And I think it's important to recognize that the journeys a lot of people have been through are diverse, are scary, and involve a profound loss of agency over what is going on in their lives. And in some cases, a lot of loss of control and high vulnerability during traumatic situations, all of which are predictors of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, and are things that we as clinicians should be picking up on and intervening on. And so as we think about the potential trajectory of someone, whether they are leaving Puerto Rico after a hurricane or migrating off of their farm in Nicaragua, it is important to think about not only the event that may have caused them to leave, but also the emotions around that loss of place, of family, of community, of job, of sense of purpose. And some of the things that may have happened along the way, whether interpersonal violence or other issues that may continue even after they arrive in the community you're serving them in, if they have arrived in New Hampshire. in terms of legal or financial issues or ongoing social stress. And there's quite a lot we can do as clinicians to address that, which is beyond the scope of this talk. Long-term, we also need to be thinking about how we integrate people into our communities as productive, happy members of our society. And a lot of that boils down to connecting people with good primary care, community health centers, great respect to everyone who works in those, and to community organizations or agencies from the government that can provide assistance. So in quick review here of the key points, there are a lot of different climate-related hazards from heat to sea level rise. And these can cause people to move. They can, in some cases, make people so poor they are unable to move. And they may contribute to political instability and conflict. And we need to be aware that our patients who have navigated journeys to reach us may have navigated some pretty complicated and upsetting situations involving the people that got them there and the borders they crossed. We need to talk about people using the legally correct term and ideally terms that they can identify with. And be aware that you don't have to cross an international border to fall into a category of people that have been profoundly affected by climate change, displaced from your community, and maybe in need of support beyond us checking your blood pressure. So I will pause there. I'm very interested to hear everybody's perspective on this. I saw there were some really good questions and thoughts in the chat. And I don't know that I have any answers, but I think it's important that we as a community develop some.